thank you guys for coming on a beautiful Saturday. It's so impressive you have nothing better to do. But no, it's a fantastic crowd, and we're incredibly excited to have Zita here with us today. I won't talk but for a minute, but I was fortunate enough to be seated next to Zita at a dinner at the U.S. Ambassador's house in Ottawa. And we chatted a bit, and she told me a lot about her project and Fogo Island and her background and stuff, and it was just extraordinarily compelling, to the point where I came home to April raving about it, and then we decided we had to go up and see for ourselves what this was about, which we did do, and it lived up to our expectations and our dreams. Just very briefly about Zita, she's comes out of a business background. She's was a controller for two tech companies, one a fiber optics company and the other a frozen earth exploration. Is that what it's called? Cold region technology company, which had to figure out ways of measuring ice stress on steel hulls of ships or pylons for oil rigs, and also wave actions and stuff before they could numerically figure out how to do it. And before she left that company, some surfer kid came to them wanting to develop a wave pool that they could surf on. So the technology they leased to this thing that's become sort of a worldwide phenomenon of indoor waves for surfers. So that's one small aspect of what she did. The most impressive before Fogo Island was she worked for a startup fiber optics company called JDS. JDS, just do something. What? Jones, somebody, and somebody else. Okay. Anyway, she started. She was telling me they started in 1989 with 89 employees, and by the time she left, there were 40,000. So she's somebody that knows how to grow, expand business, how to manage that part of it, which is just an extraordinary skill set unto itself, especially as an artist. I have no concept of that. And then sailed around the world and did all kinds of stuff before deciding to go back to Fogo and begin the Fogo Island project, which is really quite extraordinary, as you will see. So let's give a warm hand for Zita Cobb.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Thank you for inviting me wherever April is. April for president. Okay, I'm going to talk until someone says stop. And if you feel you need to leave, please, I won't be hurt. If you feel you need to have a nap, I won't be hurt. So I'm going to try and tell you the story for the last 400 years on Fogo Island. And I'm going to try and do it in 45 minutes. So there's a Newfoundland musician named Alan Doyle who grew up in St. John's, which is the capital of Newfoundland. And when he came to Fogo Island, he said, "It's like a place you can't believe, but always hoped existed." And I feel, the most important thing to know about me is that I am an 8th generation Fogo Islander, which European people settled in around 1640. And Newfoundland and Labrador is the name of the province. Actually, Carolyn was just pointing out to me that on Fogo Island today, at this moment, it's 30, I don't know the Fahrenheit, it's 37 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a bit unusual, cold for this time of year. And we are at 49 degrees and I think we're at 41 here. So it's really not that far, but it's a whole other world away. Okay, so maybe a small island is a good proxy for a small planet. And so the learnings of Fogo Island, I think, have relevance to other places. Well, this is an island, so it has to have some relevance here. Every time I say Fogo Island, I'm assuming that you're going to fill in the name of a place that means something to you. And if you don't have a community that means something to you, I highly recommend you get one, because it changes everything. It's the lens through which everything can make sense. And I think the question, the human question we're all living through right now. Okay, I'll get closer. I'll move it higher. How's that? Is that any better? Okay, I won't stand back. I'll stand right here. I think the question for communities everywhere, whether they're in Newfoundland and Labrador or whether they're in New York, is it possible for communities to continue belonging to the world? Because as we sit here now, communities are falling out of the story of the world. Not only that, actually, people are falling out of the story of the world. I think we're living through this really bizarre time in human history that it's become very difficult to belong. And I think we can, with some small changes to some important things, create a world where communities can belong. And that's what really my talk is going to be about. So everybody knows this concept of wicked problems. A wicked problem has nothing to do with spirituality. A wicked problem is just a problem that is so incredibly complex that it's hard to know what's the symptom and what's a root cause. And so I think at this moment, and my career was largely in technology. I was the chief financial officer of that company that Eric mentioned called JDS Uniphase. And we made wave division multiplexing optical devices that enabled the digital revolution. And so I think it's so interesting that we human beings are like teenagers when it comes to our relationship with money, which is super immature, and our relationship with technology, which is also very immature. So we have to hurry up and grow up. And one of the things I'll say about Fogo Island is we had no money. I'm going to be 60 this summer. And if anybody read the beautiful article that was in the Sag Harbor Express, I go around the world saying I've lived in 3 centuries, and I'm only 60, or going to be 60. But really, when I was growing up, there was no bank. We had no money. And so we were not a capital accumulating society. So I feel in my lifetime I've had to make a relationship with money, and it's still a complicated relationship. It's one of the most complicated relationships we each individually have. In any event, of all of these wicked problems that we have, it's hard to know where to start. And so maybe what I'm going to suggest as I go through this, I think we should start with some idea of community. And by the way, these wicked problems, nobody gets away free. I always love this quote from Stanislav Lech. We are all implicated in the mess we've made for ourselves, and we're all victims of it at the same time. So let's just say we're all in it together. So this is this company, JDS Uniphase. That fellow, this was probably around 2000, or maybe late 90s. So I was the chief financial officer. He was the CEO. And he immigrated to Canada from ex-Czechoslovakia. He's a physicist, and his name is Joseph Strauss. Anyway, he's the S in JDS. He used to come in every morning. It was a tech company, right? He would come in every morning, and he'd say, the most important thing is to keep the most important thing the most important thing. And we were a tech company, and we knew the most important thing was we had to stay at the very tip of that wave. Otherwise, you'd just be swamped, and, you know, in the technology world, you eat your own and move on. And so we were very successful at that, which is why the company grew so much, because we kept buying little companies around the world that had bits of technology that were important to fiber optics and to these devices we were making. And so I was responsible for mergers and acquisitions, and I saw lots and lots and lots of little communities on every continent, and I saw how important businesses were to the fabric of these communities. And so I learned this, I learned it a bit earlier, but the whole idea that business exists for a reason, and what is the reason? Shouldn't it be there to serve the human beings that it's working with? Anyway, but learning it from him. So I think as we navigate out of these wicked problems we're in, the most important thing was told to us by a guy named E.F. Schumacher, who wrote a book called Small is Beautiful. Anybody here read this book called Small is Beautiful? A few people. Small is Beautiful. It came out in the mid-70s, and he's sort of called a hippie economist. He immigrated to the United States from Germany, and he was an economist, and these sentences, I sort of live by them. Nature and culture are the two great garments of human life. I have never met a human being that disagrees with that. I meet lots of human beings that don't act as if it were true. His other great sentence, or there were many, is business and technology are the two great tools that can and should serve them. So I read this in maybe 1977, and I thought at the time, this is the most important book I've ever read. And I was studying business. I still think it's the most important book I've ever read. And he's coming back into style a little bit. So I think this is the most important thing. And what we're all trying to figure out how to do is how do we move from a different relationship where we get nature and culture as masters and business and technology as servants, because we've had it the wrong way around, at least for the last 50 years, if not longer. And so I'm also a big fan of this fellow, Gil Chin Lim, who was a South Korean man who immigrated to the United States. Unfortunately, he died a bit too young, and not much of his work has been translated into English. But he coined this phrase, humanistic globalization. It's like, of course, globalization. We all want to belong to the world, and anyway, that ship has sailed. But the question is, how do we create a global network of intensely local places? Because nobody wants to live in the generic. And there's no joy in the generic. There's no knowledge in the generic. It just crushes our souls. But yet we go around the world creating more generic, more generic. We just visit the same franchises in different places. And so I think that's kind of crushing our spirit in ways we don't realize. By the way, every photograph that I'm showing tonight, except when I tell you, and there's only a few, are from Fogo Island. And this was also Gil Chin Lim's work. So he called for the fourth revolution in human history, which is a revolution of values. So I want to say this crisis of belonging that I talked about at the beginning is, of course, causing a crisis of meaning. And I think at the root of it is a crisis of values, certainly, but of value. And this idea that as we human beings have lost our ecological embeddedness, we've lost our sense of value. What's the worth of something? And we have resorted to the only thing we know, which is to measure the value of everything in financial terms, which is, of course, ridiculous. But it's part of what's gotten us into this pickle that we're in together. And so I think this is the most important question we have to answer. We have to answer it as human beings, individually. We have to answer it as companies, and we have to answer it as communities. What are we optimizing for? Because we have a whole bunch of maximizing behavior going on that adds up to sort of organized irresponsibility. And I want to suggest that we should be optimizing for some sense or some notion of human community. And I want to make a distinction between a community and a network. When people say I belong to an online community, that's ridiculous. By definition, it cannot be a community if it's an online. You can be a part of a network, and networks are super important. But a community is when there's a snowstorm and you need to get dug out. Your neighbor is going to come over, or you're sick and there's a neighbor. It's when you have a shared fate, F-A-T-E, you know you have a shared fate, and you act like you have a shared fate. And I think it all starts with geography, because culture, community holds on to culture. And culture is nothing more than a human response to a physical place. And I think community is actually what holds the things that are sacred to us. Now, I want to talk about sacred. This is from the work of a fellow named Charles Eisenstein, who's, I think, a New Yorker. Of all of my years in business, working in business, studying business, nobody ever talked about this notion of sacred capital. Something is sacred if it carries a unique essence that has emerged out of a specific set of circumstances, and if destroyed, cannot easily be replaced. And all of those, you can add spiritual capital to this, but human capital, social capital, cultural capital, you keep going. All of those things exist in a human community. It's like community is like the container into which we put all of this. And then, of course, there's money, which is hugely important, but not sacred. And of all the problems we have, a shortage of money is not one of them. We human beings are exceptionally good at making money. And generally speaking, money is made by the interaction of money with these sacred things. And often, it's not good for the sacred capital. It doesn't win in the end. And so I think we're lucky, because I think we've started to realize what we're doing can't carry on. And so we're busy trying to find what is that right relationship. And I would say that because of the way my life has evolved, and I will tell you the story of Fogo Island now, I think I appreciate this probably more than anybody on the planet. So now we're going to go to Fogo Island. So Newfoundland, you see it up there. Fogo Island's off the coast of Newfoundland. We're at 49 degrees, 44 minutes north. What is really important about Fogo Island is that it's in the Labrador Current, which is one of the coldest, fastest moving ocean currents on the planet. And really, it comes down from the coast of Greenland. It's Greenland you see at the top there. And it sweeps down the coast of Fogo Island, and it meets the Gulf Stream on the south coast of Newfoundland, which is where the great populations of codfish were, of course. And so when I grew up on Fogo Island, I barely knew Canada existed. We joined Canada as a province only in 1949. I was born in 1958. And when I went away to university after high school, all the older generation said, "So you're going up to Canada?" And we really identified mostly with England, because we at one point were a colony of England. And there it is off the northeast coast of Newfoundland. The province is actually Newfoundland and Labrador. Labrador is so enormous, I don't put it on my map because it makes Newfoundland look too small. And in all of this land lives 500,000 people. That's it. And here's Fogo Island, and we are, at this moment, are about 2,500 people. There are 10 little communities that, when I was growing up, I was born and raised in the community at the top called Joe Bat's Arm. I was 13 years old before I went to the nearest community called Tilting. And so that gives you a sense of, and we didn't go because there was no reason to go. We had everything we needed in Joe Bat's Arm. One of the great difficulties we had when we really got into trouble, and I'm going to tell you about this, is because we didn't know each other, and because there were religious differences among the communities on the island. I mean, we were all Christians, but, you know, there were United people, and there were Anglican people and Catholic people, and we didn't get along for 350 years. It's kind of crazy. But in any event, one day we woke up and decided to get along, and now we get along. But one of the reasons we didn't get around was that. But we didn't have a high social capital. And so we were fishing people that worked in family groups. I want to point out we don't have Sag Harbor. What we have Stag Harbor. And actually, Stag Harbor is the newest community on Fogo Island because these people resettled from these outer islands to Stag Harbor. And a little bit of a sense of the place and of the sacred capital of the place. Architecture has figured very large in the projects that we have done, and I just want to give you a sense of the older buildings of the inshore fishery. So we were inshore fishing people, meaning we never fished out of sight of land. And everything we had, we made ourselves. And so where this man is coming up from his boat, that thing is called a fishing stage. It's the most important building in making a living because it's where you bring your fish in. And when we say fish in Newfoundland, we mean cod. If I want to say halibut, I'll say halibut, but I won't. And you get a sense, lots of seabirds. These are puffins. They come mid-June and leave us in September and come back the next year. This is a North Atlantic cod. It's a really good size one, and I'm going to tell you the story of that. I love showing this photograph to Fogo Islanders because they never see the whale. They only see the headland, which is called Round Head, because when you come back from the traditional fishing grounds, it's what you steer home by. And when I was 9, I saw my first helicopter and my first caribou, because the provincial government of Newfoundland was really afraid we were going to starve to death out on the island, so they sent these caribou, and they came by helicopter. They brought 7, and now we have about 400 of them. And there is a hunt every year. And this is one of my favorite. We have 7 seasons. This is pack ice season. So this is multi-year ice that has come down from the Arctic. And it's like a moving sculpture garden. and it comes in with the current, and the wind blows it on the land, and you can hear it rubbing up against the shore and against each piece against the other. And, by the evening, it could be gone again. But it's a super dynamic time of year. And then come the icebergs. So we're in iceberg season now. And, they're like pieces of the moon that fell into the sea, Alistair MacLeod, of course. And I grew up like this, which is to say I grew up feral. When I went away from home and started working and being in boardrooms and all of that, it always amazed me that nobody knew the phase of the moon. I mean, even here, tonight, who knows the phase of the moon? It's a kind of a crazy thing. Is it full tonight? Okay. But it's a super important thing. It controls everything. It controls our very bodies. Yet we humans are so arrogant. We go around the world as if it doesn't matter or doesn't exist. And so these kids know the tidal range, and they know when the tide's coming in. And so to go back a little bit, everybody knows about Christopher Columbus. He sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Well, fewer know about an Italian man named Giovanni Caboto, or John Cabot, in 1497 was looking for India, and he bumped into Newfoundland. And he wrote a letter back to the king, which I always wondered how that letter got there, which said, "Sire, the fish are so plenty, they stay the progress of my ships." He had found one of the biggest populations of fish on the planet, which was the North Atlantic cod. It is the most important fish that swims in any ocean. You just have to take my word for that. It has more protein than any other fish, and it is the superior cousin of the Icelandic cod. And when somebody tries to sell you something called ling cod, remember, that's a marketing ploy. It's not a cod. Anyway, you can always tell it from its barbel. Anyway, there's very little you need to know about a Newfoundlander that you can't figure out from this fish. And I highly urge you to read a book written by a New Yorker named Cod, but the fellow who wrote it is Mark Kurlansky, who is, I think, a great writer anyway. And so buildings like this are at least 200, 250 years old that we know of. And this went on, fishing like this for 350 years. So this is a typical boat. And you can be sure these men are relatives because we fished in family units. And then this happened. It took 30 years to bring this fish to the point of ecological extinction. When we humans put our mind to something, we get it done. And so this, at that time, when I was 8, Canada had a 12-mile limit. But we could see these things well inside that. I mean, we could see them within 5 miles of our coast. And my dad used to come back and say, "It's bigger than the church, these things." To which my mother would say, "The Protestant church?" Because that was the biggest church. And bigger than the Protestant church. So this went on day and night, year round. Every nation on earth. And then, of course, if you look at 1968 on this chart, it was the peak of the landing. So you can imagine in the fishing companies that control these boats, it was a great cause for celebration. Earnings were up. What's not to be happy about? What they weren't looking at was a chart like this. It's no coincidence, in the same year, the biggest drop in the biomass of the cod. Now, to be fair to the business people of the day, they didn't have this data in real time. And I think I'd like to think the business ethic has changed. And so what happened was the inshore fishery that we were a part of collapsed immediately. There were still cod in the offshore, but not in the inshore. So it was like waking up in the morning, and take a man like my father, who was a 7th generation Fogo Islander. Everything that man knew overnight was useless. And where do you go from there? And so what happened was the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, faced with this hundreds and hundreds of tiny little communities who didn't have running water, didn't have education. My parents couldn't read and write. We didn't get electricity till 1971. We didn't have health care. It was a big problem. Their response to the collapse of the fishery was, everybody's got to move. Just move. And we're going to bring everybody into some town somewhere, and we're going to try and find them a job, which, of course, doesn't work. You just end up creating a huge mess of unemployment. And so on Fogo Island, and this was very typical, when people left these communities, they took their houses with them. We live in little wooden houses with no basements. You just take the house. And so actually the house that I live in, which was my uncle's, has been moved 5 times. On Fogo Island, it played out a little bit differently because we were the beneficiaries, I call it, of a miracle in a way, because at a time that we were facing resettlement, and I could hear my parents in the night talking when they thought kids don't hear. Parents think the kids can't hear because they say the craziest things in the night that kids do hear. And, you know, my mother, like, where are we going to end up? What's going to happen to us? Around that time, a program started with the National Film Board of Canada that was called Challenge for Change. It was an anti-poverty program aimed at trying to understand root causes of poverty, whether they were urban or whether they were rural. And the university, based in St. John's, came to Fogo Island to make kind of an intervention. And so this is now called a Fogo process. It's kind of a famous participatory film process. And what happened was, along came this filmmaker named Colin Lowe, who made 27 beautiful little documentaries that are all online. I highly encourage you to go look at them. But for us as citizens, we went from the government officials who came and said, there's nothing here, you people are not educated, you don't have anything, you have to go, to these artists who showed up in the form of these filmmakers who were full of questions about, well, what do you know? And what do you care about? And what do you think might be possible? And so when you start talking about what might be possible, everything suddenly becomes possible. As a direct result of the Fogo process, we found a way to stay because it brought, remember those 10 communities that didn't talk to each other? All of a sudden we were talking to each other. They showed us the films. So I remember seeing a film. I grew up in Jobat's Arm, and there was a man from Deep Bay on the film. And he talked in a very funny accent to me. But I could relate to what he was saying, and we all could. And it really caused people to come together because it kind of short-circuited our brains a little bit, because art does that. Art sort of invokes your whole being. And as a result, we formed a cooperative that owns the fishery on Fogo Island to this day. So we have adapted over the years to different species, to crab and northern shrimp and turbot, and we stayed. We made a new industry of a different kind of a species, and that happened because of art. Now, I have to say, if you need to go out in the ocean and explore for oil, you're not going to do it with a community-owned co-op. But if you need to run a fishery in a little island, you don't need to do it in a multinational. So I think finding, as a business person, the most exciting thing is business is a great tool, but let's use it appropriately. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of local ownership, especially in small places, of all of the forms of capital. And so that has what has caused us to hang on. So my father was Lambert. He couldn't read and write, so he couldn't adapt to these other fisheries because he couldn't learn to use the charts on the boat. So he was basically put out of the fishery because of technological change that he couldn't adapt to. But he used to always say this, to us, who in their right minds would catch all the fish? He never understood why they couldn't see that it was going to cause a catastrophe. And then he finally concluded, he said, they must be turning fish into money, which is, of course, exactly what was happening. And so I went off to university to study business because I wanted to understand what the heck happened. Why did they catch all the fish? And the most important thing that happened when I was in business school, because I think business schools are actually quite dangerous places. They turn out sort of robotic people that have these levers that are not properly educated to understand the whole. But I saw cauliflower for the first time. And it struck me that, it's a beautiful fractal, right? It's a pattern that repeats and repeats. And it hit me that Fogo Island is one of these little florets. And Ottawa, where I was studying, is a bigger floret, and New York's a bigger floret, all held together by the stem. And, of course, this is the time I'm reading Schumacher and Small is Beautiful. And I realized that the stem has two jobs to do. I mean, and the stem is our human media, our human systems, right? Technology and business and our distribution systems. It's all the stem. And it has two jobs. One job, hold us all together, because we actually want to be held together. And the second job it has is bring nutrition to the florets, which are the communities. And, of course, in 1968, these fishing companies forgot their job. And they deprived the florets of what they needed to be healthy, and the communities died. This is happening all the time, every day. Doesn't need to happen. So anyway, this kind of, you will never think about cauliflower the same way, I hope. And this is another great Schumacher thing. Get up in the morning, look at the world, try to see it as whole. That is super hard work. What it means is, for everything we do, think about the implications on the whole, on everybody around us in particular. So I moved back home in 2006 after this career. I had money from my career that I didn't need to live my life. And I thought, I'm going to go home and figure out how to strengthen the community. And so with my brothers, first thing we did is we set up a charity called Shorefast. I mean, charity is hugely important, I'm not that interested in charity. I don't think it's the way it's not sustainable, obviously, but I'm really interested in business, and I'm interested in using philanthropic funds to create businesses that can belong to a community and sustain people for decades to come. So our horizon when we started was we want to do things that are going to last at least 100 years. And then after that 100 years, somebody else has to figure out what we're going to do for the next 100. And so what we decided to do was this. So we have the charity at the top. We started 3 businesses. Well, we have a few more now, but this was the original. We have an inn, which I'll talk about. We have a shop, which makes furniture. And we have a little fish business that complements to co-op that I talked about. And so the idea is these are social businesses, meaning they're for-profit businesses. Profit goes back up to the charity and gets invested on the other side in a whole set of charitable programs. I think about all those programs, most important one being art and geology. We do a lot of heritage restorations and boat building programs and all of that. Really what that's all about is knowledge. It's either about preserving knowledge, adding to the knowledge, or sharing knowledge. Because really the well-being of a community is about knowledge. That's how we should be measuring our wealth, our human wealth. And so it makes a kind of a nice circle. All of the businesses on the island are owned locally. So this is what we build on. The most important thing, our pillars are art, and I'll talk about that, the inn, which is a hospitality project, obviously, and fish, which is the co-op, to which we've done a whole bunch of other projects that add to that, but that core is kind of the heartbeat. And then we look at what are the other things that we can keep this going and figure out how we're connected to people in Botswana, because we're connected to everybody. And so thinking about your world in that way makes it easier to make decisions. This is the most important piece of knowledge that I came to in starting this project at home. When you come out of the business world, you're actually very dangerous because you think you know everything. You think, oh, I'm just going to get this organized. I've got money. I'm going to get people hired. We're going to get it done. That is a totally arrogant way to start something. And there was a mayor at the time in Joe Bat's Arm who said, you need to slow down. This cannot, he said, community development should happen at the speed of human trust. And so first, slow down. And secondly, he said, go and get yourself educated about something called ABCD, asset-based community development. Because what tends to happen when communities get into trouble is we over-focus on the deficiencies. Oh, they're poor, or they're unhealthy, or whatever that is. Nothing good ever comes of over-focusing on someone's deficits. Asset-based community development is beautiful because it asks, what do we know? Surely we must know something. What do we have? What do we love? What do we miss? And what can we do about it? And as soon as you get down that path, you are doing proper community development. I love the work of Tim Jackson, who wrote a book called Prosperity Without Growth. He has this beautiful pentagon, which is here, of an economy that works. And he includes politics and society and systems. He puts art, so he gets full points from me. He puts meaning. And Seamus Heaney, the great poet, said, if we can find the words, maybe we can find a way. And I find it hugely encouraging to come across economists like Tim Jackson, and there are many others now, who are developing economic models for more progressive economies. And so, yeah, if you have created an economy where it's not possible to make meaning, well, that's clearly not an economy that works. These are the things we steer by. Community is a basic building block of human life. Of course it is, if not the basic building block. Place itself is not a commodity. It shouldn't be treated as a commodity, not by me, not by you, not by real estate developers. It carries intrinsic value. There are many ways of knowing. This man is a boat builder. He was a fisherman. If you want to know what that man thinks, you don't send him an email. Learning how to engage with each other in proper conversations is important to any kind of progress. We believe deeply that art, if you have a really hard problem to solve, you better work with art and work with artists, because it's just a different way of seeing the world. And it's a way of belonging. It's not that art knows all the answers, but it's a part of the puzzle. It's a part of the whole. And I think the richest communities are the ones that have a meaningful presence of art makers and art thinkers within the community. 10 years ago, I started saying this. I said, business must be not just for profit. And 10 years ago, I could feel all the corporate people in the room sort of rolling their eyes, thinking, right, of course not. People don't roll their eyes at this anymore. I think the best companies are operated as if they are not just for profit. And that makes a social business. And I think this is what's happening in the world. The for-profit world and the not-for-profit world are kind of learning from each other and coming together. And I think in my lifetime, the best companies will be not just for profit and will be social businesses. And of course, what we're trying to do with all these projects is figure out how do we belong to the world. We've been building little wooden houses on Fogo Island for 400 years. Nobody much noticed. When we started building contemporary architecture, we were suddenly in Architectural Digest. Design is a funny thing. I don't know when this happened, but it used to be that the maker, the craftsperson, was also the designer. And then somewhere along the way, design as a profession separated and took off, and the traditional craftspeople got left behind. And of course, design quickly became the handmaiden of business. And so I'm super excited about why can't we make design a servant of place and of the traditional? And that is effectively what we've done. So a little walk through what our programs are. So Fogo Island Arts is a residency-based contemporary art program. We publish, we have dialogues. If anybody's from Chicago, we have a dialogue coming up in the fall in Chicago. See, that's our latitude, 4937. We built studios for artists that were designed by a Newfoundland-born architect named Todd Saunders. This is the first thing that we built. All of these studios are off the grid. We collect rainwater. They have composting toilets, solar panels, and wood-burning stoves. You can't drive to them. You have to walk. It's not a bad place to work. And so you get a sense, that's another of the studios, you get a sense of the Caribou. This would be in February month. This is the one that was in the Sag Harbor Express. That was actually conceived as a writer's studio. And you get a sense. This is called the Squish Studio. The artists don't live in those studios. We used to be 6,000 people at our peak, and now we're 2,500. It is our ambition to be 6,000 again. But if you have lost that many people, you have a lot of houses that need love. And so taking money, philanthropic money, putting it into the restoration of homes like this is a way of investing in the sacred. And so we've done that. This was one of the early shows and the publication for that show, Kate Newby, Sin Taylor show, and the publication. So that's, and I want to pause on this to say architecture, and I know there's at least one architect in the room today, or tonight, architecture has a very important job to do. That old building without the new one would make us all sad, because I think we'd feel for the people whose lives were lived for what? Did it all come to nothing? The new building without the old one would be some young upstart architect's idea of beauty. Who cares? It would be an ego play. Architecture has the job, of course, creating beauty and function, but it also has the job of carrying time. And these two buildings are in a conversation with each other. And through them, you can feel time. And I think our human systems crave diversity. They also crave a relationship with time. That's why we can never get enough of Italy. And I think he's done a pretty reasonable job of carrying time. Then we decided to build an inn. And if you're going to build an inn on a bald rock in the North Atlantic, you start with a picture like this. And it didn't seem so daunting until we got started. We went to the government of Newfoundland and said, we are going to put in 80% of the money, but we want you to be partners with us because they run the ferry. And so we asked the federal government for 10% of the money, and we asked the province for 10%. And we got a letter back from the province which said this. This is not normal, practical, reasonable, or rational. So we thought, well, it must be the right thing to do then. Everything that is the right thing to do doesn't make any sense in the moment you realize that it's the right thing to do. Anyway, they did come on board, and so we were happy that other people came to realize that maybe it was impracticable. Let's try it. And so we got busy building this inn, which has 29 rooms, is made of wood, it has a steel frame, it's made by Fogo Islanders, and it was like a place that we could put what we knew, because the way a society practices hospitality tells you everything about the culture of people. How do you care for others? And there it is, all done. And we were very grateful to another New Yorker, Mr. Bloomberg, for saying it's certainly remote and magical. And this one actually, it was the first time in this project I ever felt really frightened, was when this came out in Architectural Digest, because I thought, wow, was it really that daring? It didn't seem so bad when we started. In any event, all of that's important, but now I'm going to tell you what the most important thing is. So in my lifetime, we've gotten labeling on food. I'm sure you recognize this label. It started in California. It was a big brouhaha. You know, all the industrial food companies said it can't be done, anyway it got done. So we, I don't know why we chose tea. Apparently there's nothing in tea. Anyway, so we take this idea and we do this. So for everything we sell, including a stay at the inn, we tell the person who's buying it where the money goes in what we call an economic nutrition label. And what this basically does is take whatever, 25 pages of dense financial information that's only available at the end of a year and condense it to what we, as someone about to buy something, needs to know in order to make a buying decision. So my dream is everything offered for sale on the planet has an economic nutrition label. And so for a stay at the inn, 49% of what you pay to stay at the inn goes to the people who work there. And so it should. If you are in the hospitality business, you probably know that the target number for most hotels is about 30%. And let's squeeze it. We try to expand it, because we're optimizing for the well-being of the people in this community. And we can tell you geographically where the money goes. In this case, 63% of it stays on Fogo Island, 7% stays in Newfoundland, 24% stays in Canada, and 6% goes out in the rest of the world. It may not matter to you as a consumer, but if it does, you have the information with which to decide. And so we think this can make a kind of a revolution, because whatever power we have as citizens, we have way more power with our economic power. And we need to be just more thoughtful, I think, about what kind of economic agents we want to be. So there it is, all done. These are the rocks that are 420 million years old. When we started thinking about what are we going to put in this inn, we of course wanted to work with the people of the island and the skills that we have always had. And so we have a long history with making quilts and knitting and all of that. We have a long history with building boats. If you know anything about boat building, I have to tell you, these boats are made with no steaming. So we go out and find wood that is the shape it needs to be. And there's a lot of knowledge in that. And so what we decided to do was to invite designers to come. And about 20 designers came over a 3-year period in residencies. They were matched up with local makers, local boat builders and textile artisans. And they were asked to imagine what the contemporary expression of this traditional furniture was. So this was a very typical kind of a meeting. And we were like detectives in our own communities, going around opening up cupboards in old houses, trying to understand the intentions of the people that came before. It's funny, somehow we got in a conversation today about, and on Fogo Island, this is actually a conversation that happens all the time. Do dead people have rights? I think they do. And we certainly on Fogo Island feel that dead people have rights. We have a duty to carry on what these people have taught us. And by continuing to work hard to understand why did they do this, why did they make it this way, and how do we adapt that to the contemporary is the most satisfying work you can do. That you don't have to start all over. And when you think about our human lives are made of relationships, one of the most important relationships are the relationships we have with the people who are no longer here. So, and on Fogo Island, because we've had this continuity, we're lucky to have that. So designers like this young woman, she came from Montreal, she designed a chair, which is probably the rock star of the collection. These legs grew out of the ground that way. We can only make about 12 of these chairs a year because it takes a very special kind of wood. It has to be cured in a certain way. Anyway, I want to pause on this slide to say consumerism, and we're all victims of it, is not that we love things. Consumerism is that we don't love things. And that's why those things end up in the landfill, because they have no meaning to us. When we need something new in our life, whether it's a shirt or a chair, whatever that is a beautiful opportunity to be in a relationship with the maker or the community it came from. And if we understood who those people were or how they made it or out of what tradition it came, we would never allow those things to go to the landfill. We might hand them on to other people. We might fix them if they break, but they're not going to be thrown away. And I think that this deeper kind of materialism is exactly what we need to do in order to start living within the ecological bounds of the planet that we've been given. Also, it has to be beautiful, of course. And so a little tour around the inn. It's a very narrow building. It's like a ship. It's 300 feet long and 30 feet wide. And there's a library and a cinema, which is smaller than where we are tonight. This is a partnership with the National Film Board of Canada. Everything in that room, except for the bathtub, pretty much we made on Fogo Island. The bathtub we got from Quebec. And the dining room was kind of like the prow of the ship. Fogo Island has 26 kinds of edible berries. When we first opened, we were serving orange juice. And, of course, we invited every citizen of Fogo Island to come stay at the inn because they own the inn. I mean, because the charity puts the money back in. The effective owners are the community. So one woman came and she said, it's all very lovely. She said, but I don't understand why you people are serving orange juice up there. I said, well, obviously we didn't think about it very deeply. She says, you know, we have 26 kinds of edible berries, and all of them would be happy to be a juice if you just ask them. And so so now we only serve orange juice if somebody really desperately needs to have orange juice. And these are partridge berries, which is the lingonberry. And the white thing there is, we call it caribou moss, but it's not, it's a lichen actually, but that's what the caribou sustains themselves by eating that. You can grow just about anything on that bald rock in the North Atlantic. And I mentioned earlier, we have a micro-lending fund, which is modeled after the Grameen Bank, and it offers very friendly small loans to people to start businesses on the island. This little greenhouse was the first application for a loan. A man borrowed the money in the spring and paid it back in the fall. And so I think making money available to people who most of the banks wouldn't even look at is a really important way of enabling communities. And we didn't intend to get into the furniture business, but when guests started to come and wanted to buy the furniture, we thought, okay, well, all these woodworkers need to keep working or we're going to lose the knowledge. And so we kind of backed ourselves into a furniture business. Of course, for the furniture business, we also do economic nutrition labeling. So for this little table, and you can see that one leg is made by the offcut of the other, we also tell you where the money goes. The furniture business was run in this building. All of my life, this building has been falling down. It takes a toll on a community when its important buildings are falling down. And so it took us a long time, but we finally cobbled together enough money to fix it up. And you could feel all of us standing a little bit taller. You know, in the business world, and there must be somebody here from the business world, there is this notion of a company being a going concern. That's why we do business with a company, because we expect it's going to be there tomorrow. We make contracts we expect the company to fulfill. But in the world of communities, we don't treat them as if they're going concerns. And so this kind of investment, when people get behind it and go, this is a going concern, we're going to be here for at least another 350 years, then people's behavior changes. Anyway, the funny thing is, of course, now people say, oh, this is too new. It looks too new. Anyway, so we'll just wait a couple of years and it won't look so new. We're always looking for woodworkers. And remember, we have to get back to 6,000 people. So if you know any woodworkers, definitely looking for woodworkers. This is the little fish business that my baby brother started, which takes the handline cod. So the cod, by the way, are still under moratorium, but we have a stewardship fishery, and we catch them one by one, and we sell them to very lovely restaurants, mostly in Toronto, so we can get the best price for the fishermen. This is Austin Reed. He has never caught a fish except one by one, with just a line. One hook, one line. And there's a film, which is also online, made by the National Film Board of Canada. It's a very short film, which I highly recommend if you care about fish at all. But the thing I will tell you about fish is please don't eat any fish that you don't exactly know who caught it and where it came from, because it was probably caught illegally on the high seas. And we also do economic nutrition labeling for our fish business. We have a whole program which we call an ocean ethic, which is around creating a more deeper relationship with the ocean, and all kinds of initiatives that have to do with better ways of fishing, understanding the creatures of the ocean. I'm sure you all know there's a massive problem of plastics in the ocean. And I think about all of that ocean ethic as turning, as my dad said, they must be turning fish into money. So now we turn money into fish. And that's what money is good for. Money is good to protect and invest in and strengthen the sacred. Fish are sacred. I think everybody knows this is true. We are suffering from a plague of sameness. This next photograph is not from Fogo Island. I just put it up to ask, why do we build this? Why do we allow it to be built in our communities? I think because our human brains over-focus on things we can measure. And the payback period on this is probably 5 years. In the meantime, it's crushed our souls. And it's going to go to the landfill, and it's going to crush our ecology. And so the next time someone proposes this in a community near you, you just need to say no. And I don't believe these Amazon people. I think we do want to see each other. We need to go out to shops, and we will. And the next time we build it, we just got to do it in a way that has some relevance for the place it's in. I try to not use the word sustainability because I think it's like love and community. These are words that we've overused so much we don't know what they mean. But I love this way of describing it. It was actually from an architecture magazine, that an acceptance of precariousness is a prerequisite to permanence. And if you live on a little island in the North Atlantic, you know it's precarious. We are thinking, I think we've gone beyond thinking, I think we've decided to start an Institute of Community Economics, which is a way of bringing together business people, people in the corporate world who care about communities, and I think everybody cares about communities. I think it's not always clear how to act in the interest of a community, so it brings together corporate people, it brings together community development people. I mean, if you're the mayor or a council member of a small town or a big town, you need to understand part of your job is proper economic development and behaving properly with the business people in your midst who are trying to have strong businesses and do the right thing by community. So I think we'll do that. This is Aubrey Payne, who knows more about business than I ever will. I think Aubrey will definitely be on the board. One of our first things we want to do, we've started, is, you know, the game Monopoly? That game was invented by a woman, apparently, in 1906. And she was a person who had a bit of a radical way of seeing the world. She thought that it was wrong for land to be owned privately. I don't agree with that, but that was her belief. And she invented the game to show us the terrible results that would come from allowing land to be owned privately. But instead of getting the message, we decided to teach our children how to play it on public holidays and bankrupt their siblings. So, but I mean, Monopoly is basically a zero-sum game, right? And if you get up in the morning and you think it's a zero-sum game, you are not going to be your best self. But if you got up in the morning and thought it's a positive-sum game, you're going to be your best self. So we're reinventing Monopoly so that it's a positive-sum game. And it's going to work because we have a 10-year-old, 12-year-old, and a 14-year-old working on it, so you know they're going to get it right. And we've moved around 2 letters, so it's going to be called No-mopoly. And I'm sure we'll be sued, but that's fine. I'm winding down. The point of everything I've said is this. Each and every one of us is responsible for the ongoing creation of our communities. It is everyday work. What matters is what we do. My father used to say, I don't care what you think. I don't care what you feel. I only care what you do. Because it's only what you do that makes any difference to anybody else. And the happy news is everything that everybody does matters. It matters a lot. Because one tiny little thing leads to another thing and another thing. And I leave you with a poem, which is from a New Zealand poet, The Art of Walking Upright, which is what we're all trying to figure out how to do. The art of walking upright is the art of using both feet. One is for holding on to who we are, what we have, what we love, holding on to our own identities, our own past. And the other one is for reaching out, because we don't want to build walls and live all by ourselves. We want to belong to the world. So this motion of walking, of holding on and reaching out, is what I will call proper community economic development. And that is the end. Thank you very much.
We're going to chat for a few minutes, take questions and stuff. So stay here.
So should we use these microphones?
I think so, yeah. I had the strongest urge to cry through that presentation. It was so beautiful in its intelligence and in its sense of belonging, its sense of, there was like a passion and an urgency for being connected in a way that it's just profound. And so I thank you. I know none of you wanted to cry with me, but anyway, I'm sure you all have a lot of questions, so we'll keep it, short in terms of that. But tell me the story of how you got into business at 11 years old.
Right. So, because we were off an island, far away from far away, the Canada Revenue Agency hardly realized we existed. And we were, a super poor community, and we didn't have cash, right? There was no money anyway. And then finally they figured out, wait a minute, these people haven't ever filed a tax return. And so nasty letters started arriving at the post office, aimed at everyone, saying, you people need to be filing tax returns. So my dad gave me these letters, and I was 11, and I could read. And so I read it to him. He said, this sounds really bad. What are we going to do? And so anyway, but they sent the forms. So at 11 years old, I did the tax return for my dad. And miracle of miracle, he got money back. And so, because his basic personal exemption was far greater than the zero income that he had. And so the next year I started doing taxes for all the fishermen. So I was in business by the time I was 12.
I love that story. And,
if I do your tax return, I promise you'll get money back.
Yeah. But the thing that I find so impressive was that you find within yourself a skill set that actually turns out to be quite extraordinary, and you develop it. You go on to do business and to be successful at it. Working within the newest of technologies. I think one of your business partners was into artificial intelligence way back when.
In Columbia, Maryland. Yeah.
In Columbia, Maryland.
Could have all been born in Columbia, Maryland, but we ran out of money.
I actually, I might have misunderstood the story, but he built a robot.
He built an autonomous
but he had no idea
robot.
why.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Except he wanted to prove that it could be done, which is like the greatest technology comes in that way.
And maybe that's what links it closest to what art does, which is...
And that's what actually my career has been about, working with people who love technology and are really possessed by wanting to push it to its limits to understand. It's always about push it, I want to understand, and they're trying to make sense of the world in a way that can be made clear or made. When this man was working on the robot, the part of the reason it failed was every time an investor came along and said, well, what does it do? It doesn't do anything. But look at all the great technology it is. And if that kind of basic research isn't done, we would never have anything that's useful. Like that is, it's super important use of money. And I guess my career has always been working with people who don't know where they're going, but they know what's important and what to pay attention to.
I think that the things that you and I have talked about over time were what resonated with me was in a somewhat direct relationship to Sag Harbor, which of course isn't Fogo Island per se, although it has a lot of history that's not dissimilar. But what struck me both about your career, which is one in which you grow up in a community that is highly insular, right? The fact that you didn't go to the community next to you for 15 years is an example of that. Highly insular, but yet you yourself forced to, but nonetheless successful at moving outside of that community and becoming a global citizen, really. And then finding some way of getting back into the community and revitalizing it with a combination of its intrinsic historical and community skill sets and a global vision. Obviously, I think you're incredibly prescient in tapping in time-wise to the eco-tourist zeitgeist, which is something that I think propelled the success of the Fogo, in terms of 5 years instead of 20 years or something like that. So there's a deep kind of awareness that you bring to this project. It's interesting, as I said, in my feelings about Sag Harbor, where this is a community that has always been cosmopolitan. And that is to say, it's always participated in an economy outside of itself, that it wasn't a consumer economy, it was a producing economy, and it participated in the shipbuilding, the whaling, the watches, the lunar landers, et cetera,
That's where knowledge comes from doing.
Yeah, and that, to me, that strikes me as that's what the DNA of this town is precisely that.
So let's not turn it into people wandering around down Main Street buying stuff, and that's all they ever do. That's you're going to lose your knowledge very quickly.
So exactly. So that becomes the next sort of set of questions that we in Sag Harbor are facing. Is we're in a town that is on the verge of transformation. It's something that the transformation's irreversible in the sense of flow, but what is it exactly that it could become that carries with it the integrity and the vitality and the intelligence of what it has always been, right? And that's the sort of meditation that I'm on.
So you're going through a process of ABCD, asset-based community development. What do we know? What do we have? What do we love? What do we miss? And what can we do about it? But for sure, the only healthy communities are communities that are producers. You have to make something. If it's just a community based around consumption, that is not a very satisfying place. I mean, art is production. So starting with art is always a good place to start. If there are skill sets that people, if you went around this community, did you say 2,500 live in Sag Harbor? If we went around to the 2,500 citizens that live here and said, so what do you know? What can you do? What do you love? What do you miss? You would actually make a kind of an inventory of skill sets that are here. And another great question that there's a fellow named John McKnight who John is 86 now, but he was the inventor of this whole ABCD. He would say to people, what would you do for your community if you knew that all your neighbors were going to help you? It's like that. It's a much different question than saying, what would you like to do for your community? Because the first thing we tend to think, oh, no one's going to go along with that. They're all going to object or whatever. But if you knew your neighbors were going to help you, what would you do? And I think going through that process, I think it takes a lot of deep conversation. That, you'll have an idea that maybe this woman doesn't agree with, or she has an idea, but at least you are in conversations about what might be done.
Okay, well, that's too hard.
Okay, you want to skip to how it gets easy. Yeah, all the important things are really hard.
Forget about it. Yeah, no, that's brilliant. That's a revelation.
But as a community, right, you have to have a point of view. You can't belong to the world. I mean, nobody can get up in the morning and say, I'm a citizen of the world. That is a very lost person. You can only belong to the world by first belonging to yourself. I mean, your most local is your own body. And once you belong to yourself, then you have to belong to your neighbors. And we have to belong to each other. And from that, we can belong to the world. But you have to stand somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, who should decide what's going to go on in this community? The 2,500 people that live here. And if you don't have a town plan, you better get one
which
in a hurry.
Reminds me, you were talking about something. We were talking about it earlier. Floaters versus liviers. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So in Newfoundland, when you remember that map of all the Europeans that came over, it was actually illegal to settle because England and France decided that we're not going to fight over Newfoundland. We're not going to fight over this fish, but everybody's going to come over in the spring, fish all summer, and then we salt the fish, dry the fish, and take the fish, go back to Europe in the fall. After 150 years of this, probably people started to feel seasick or something. It's hard to say. People started to decide to settle, and we're just an overwinter. And those people, and to this day, they're called liviers. And liviers are people who stay all year. And the people who go back to Europe were called floaters.
Which has a very specific meaning in some places.
They share some things in common, but many things are not in common. But the shape of Fogo Island was really determined by the liviers. And so now as we're growing again and trying to get back to 6,000 people, there's no question that there are people who come and spend part of the year on Fogo Island, and we don't call them floaters, we call them incomers, and we still have liviers. And finding that balance between meeting the needs of the liviers, that we have to recognize those are the most important people. They're the people that are still on watch when everybody else has gone to where the climate's nicer.
Yeah. And there was a question attached to that. But you were talking about sort of like some sort of ways that they sounded harsh but compelling in terms of determining how, like a town like Sag Harbor might slow the process down, and develop a more of a proportionate relationship between those who are highly invested in the community in terms of being liviers versus those who are in for shorter periods of time, passing through, etc. And
or worse, they're not even, they're just speculating. That's another scary thing. Yeah, I think it's a super dangerous thing to be where you are now. There's nowhere to go but the sea, and it's all going to be, if it hasn't already, it's going to be pressing up against you. And so I don't know, when do we stop believing in making public policy? Now, maybe I'm sounding like a very naive Canadian, because in Canada we have maybe different ideas than you do here about the role of government. But, why wouldn't the local government, I don't know if anybody's here from the local government, you can throw things at me, but why wouldn't the local government say, just a second, we got to catch our breath here, and we need to collect our thoughts about what kind of a community we want to be 10 years from now or 20 years from now, because that's going to come upon us really quickly. Let's just stop handing out permits for anything until we can make a proper plan. And if and then once we start to make the proper plan with a little bit of space to think, we have to say, okay, these liviers, who are these people, and how do we create a society that they and their children can continue to thrive in, and how do we get a mix of spaces that are protected in some kind of a trust that they just can't be bought up. Actually, we're about to do an art project. I started to tell you about it, and the title of it is, and it's going to be a publication, the title of it is, Does It Matter Who Owns What? Of course it matters who owns what. And just because you or me or you have the means to buy anything we want doesn't mean we should. And so just this is what I think about as this human relationship with money. We just have to grow up and realize that none of us want to live in a world that is devoid of community or devoid of diversity or devoid of history. And that is, if we leave it to its own devices, what we will do.
I would love to open it up to the audience for some questions, because I'm sure there are some. I got one in the back. Ron.
Did I just hurt your feelings? Yeah, okay. Okay. Right. And I mean, an urban community, whether it's Washington, D.C., or Toronto, or Ottawa, wherever, they are made up of smaller communities. They're made up of neighborhoods. And I think it always comes back to me, to Schumacher. The whole is made of the sum of the parts. And so whether it's Washington, D.C., actually someone said to me about New York City recently, this is someone who works in planning in New York City, said, actually, we don't have a plan.